Kia ora koutou. Welcome to our webinar today. So today's webinar is on the power of co-design for rangatahi and youth mental health, just checking everyone's in the right place. So just a very, very warm welcome to you all. Also welcome to the first day of Youth Week. So we're celebrating Youth Week this week with a powerhouse of a panel today talking to us about co-design. So I'll just start off with our karakia. Our karakia timatanga. Tēnei te ara o ranginui e tuake nei. Tēnei te ara o papatuanuku e takoto nei. Tēnei te ara o rangi rawako papa e takoto nei. Kia raro te tapu wai o tānei ki raro. Tēnei te pō, no mai te ao. Karangatia te ao e piri. Karangatia ko tane e piri e tata. Whakamaua kia tīna, hui e, tai ki e. And just for just the benefit of understanding our beautiful te reo Māori, I'll just quickly provide that karakia in English. So this is the pathway of Sky Father above us. This is the pathway of Earth Mother below us. This is the pathway of Sky Father and Earth Mother before us. Allow the souls of Tāne to settle into the path that leads us from the dark to light. Beckon the light, wisdom to embrace me. Beckon Tāne, the bearer of light and wisdom, to embrace and hold it as permanent, gathered as one. So a very warm welcome to you all. I've just got a couple of housekeeping things to mention to everyone this morning. So this session will be recorded. The chat is now open. Please feel free to introduce yourself and where you're from, share any responses or resources as we go throughout the webinar. There is a Q&A box, and that's where you add your questions. So any questions that you've got, we'll do our best to sort of summarize and collect these and answer some of these. So please put the questions in the Q&A box instead of in the chat. We've also got sign language interpretation available on the screen as well. So in terms of the chat, it is open. People's names will be visible. There is an option to ask questions anonymously if you'd like to, and we won't share the chat record. What else is there? I think we're ready to start the first session. So what I'd like to do is just briefly introduce the first 10-minute item that we've got today on the webinar. In terms of the work that we've done at Te Hiringa Mahara Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission, I've got to introduce myself. I'm the Director of Wellbeing System Leadership, Data and Insights here at Te Hiringa Mahara. In terms of the work that we're sharing with everybody today and asking our young people to speak on behalf of is very important to Te Hiringa Mahara. We've got a long-term strategic priority to look into effective solutions or what works for young people, especially young people who are experiencing early signs of distress. So this is just a part of our big program of work that we're doing, and we're just very pleased to be able to share that with you and also have people speak on this topic. So for the next 10 minutes, I'd like to invite Laura Ross, who's our Principal Advisor here at Te Hiringa Mahara, who brings her own lived experience to the work, and she's a very, very strong advocate of the space, as well as Alex Walker, who's a lived experience researcher, very passionate about youth leadership and peer support, to please speak to the key insights from the review that we did here, and also to co-design. So welcome, koroa.
Kia ora, kia ora. Ko Laura Ross tōku ingoa. I'm Laura Ross. I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about some of the work that Te Hiringa Mahara has been doing. So, I mean, we know that in Aotearoa, New Zealand, distress among rangatahi and young people has increased sharply over the past decade. The research is clear that supporting young people earlier, before distress escalates, is so important. Early support helps people now, and it reduces the long-term impacts of distress, on well-being, on education, on employment, on whānau. We know that there's many programs and services in New Zealand and internationally that provide early intervention and secondary prevention. These include Youth One-Stop Shops, the Youth Access and Choice Program, and many other programs and services that support rangatahi and young people when they first begin to experience distress or other mental health challenges. To support programs and services to work for young people who experience early signs of distress, we commissioned a review to further develop the evidence base on effectiveness. Our review drew from studies of programs and services in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that were effective in reducing distress and supporting well-being. Our findings are for people who are developing, for funding, advocating for youth mental health programs and services, and particularly those in the primary and community and digital spaces. You can read the full effectiveness review or a shorter evidence brief on our website, and we'll share that link in the chat shortly. I'm now going to tell you about 3 key findings before we introduce our awesome panel today. So firstly, young people told us they want options when they need support. The review we've done shows that a range of approaches are effective in reducing distress and supporting good mental health and well-being. This demonstrates the value of investing in a range of services and supports, including face-to-face, light touch, and online options. Secondly, we found that sustained engagement is crucial. The programs and services that young people stayed engaged with had much better outcomes than those where attendance or participation dropped off. So accessibility and acceptability are important drivers of engagement, and they support young people to get through the door and to stay there. And finally, and most importantly, because it underpins all our other findings, our review showed that co-design with young people is a critical driver of effectiveness. We think co-design should be built into every service, review, or evaluation. We think co-design should be a minimum standard for new service design. This is why we're so excited to bring you a panel today to share insights about youth co-design. Our panel is going to give you the inside information on how co-design works in practice to create accessible, youth-friendly mental health supports that young people want to engage with and stay engaged with. First of all, though, I'm really excited to hand over to Alex Walker. He's a lived experience researcher and he's going to tell you more about co-design. So thank you so much for your time.
Morena, everyone. Ko Alex Walker tōku ingoa. I am absolutely delighted to be talking about co-design just for a few minutes before we hand over to our awesome panel. And I want to begin by really thinking about why we do co-design and why that's really important in a mental health landscape. And I take a really kind of historical point of view there to acknowledge that a lot of harm has historically been done in the mental health space to people who have gone through mental health challenges. And in particular, agency being taken away, choice being taken away in favor of really asymmetrical relationships where professionals and researchers hold such dominant power over people navigating mental health challenges. And so in that context, I see co-design as a real lever to change that narrative, to actually put forward the value of people who have gone through challenges, gone through distress, and the wisdom and expertise that those experiences have created. So co-design, I think, is extremely important, in particular for that mental health context. But the power of a term is really about how it's used in practice. And so co-design, I think, has such potential, but it's really crucial that we honor that term. And we do see in the research literature that sometimes the term co-design is kind of thrown out there and not actually honored. And in fact, people say co-design, but what they really mean is consultation. So I want to really highlight what I see as really key to truly honor co-design and not just do it as a checkbox. So what does it mean to do co-design that actually is empowering and crucially shares power? So the first point that comes to my mind is about power, which is that co-design is a redistribution of power within the service or research landscape. So it's really critical that when we're doing co-design, that there are co-governance structures, that there are true partnerships between researchers and people with lived experience, or service design and people with lived experience, that it's a true partnership with true decision-making shared both ways. If, for example, you already had an intention, a plan, and then you go to people with experience and say, hey, what do you think about this? That is in that consultation zone. That wouldn't be within that equality partnership that we're looking for in co-design. So a term we often use in co-design is this idea of from inception to dissemination. So that's the idea that from the beginning, from that conceptual stage of building a service or embarking on a research project, there is that partnership in place from that very beginning process of concept. And then that carries through the entire way to the service implementation or the publication of the research, whatever that looks like. It's key that the relationship really is underpinning that entire process. Now, also, what's really important is the idea of ownership and publication. So this is particularly true for a research context where if it's true partnership, you really have to ask yourself, why aren't the people who are partnered within co-design on the publication themselves as authors? So ensuring that true credit is being given to honour that partnership. And that also enters into territory around remuneration and thinking about how are we honouring people's time and mahi and sweat and tears as they partner into a service design or a research context. Also, I want to highlight that we need to be aware of that historical context because that historical context still persists in many different forms today. There is still a lot of stigma around going through mental health challenges, and there is still troubling power dynamics that can manifest within service and research spaces between professionals and people with experience. And so you might have everyone around a room, you might have on paper shared governance, but you have to be aware that those power dynamics might still be exerting a force. So what do you do within those meetings, within those sessions to actually bring that out into the open and acknowledge it and then think about as a group, how can you untangle that and how can you really move towards a redistribution of power? So those are just a few thoughts on co-design and the importance of really honouring that term. And that's where I want to kind of leave off with, which is that we don't want co-design to be a co-opted term. We want it to really mean something. And so when we do co-design, we need to actually, do it properly and do it with respect and honour to the lived experience communities. So thank you very much. I was really pleased to be able to speak. But now we pass on to the real experts in the room, which is the youth panel. Ka kite, thank you.
Kia ora, Alex, namahe, korua. That was also somewhat an awesome way to kick off the panel. Really loved hearing your perspective on that. So we've got our panel of young people now. We've got Amy Skipper, Ariel Waldron, Maggie Shippam, and Abdulla Shiblaq to speak to us on their experience. So I will invite them to introduce themselves and also to answer a first question for us as the panel. So just thinking about the times you have been involved in co-design, could you tell us what you thought worked well in those spaces? So I'll invite Amy, Ariel, Maggie and Abdulla to speak to us now. Kia ora, namahi, welcome.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Amy. I am the founder and executive director of the Mental Health Matters Initiative, which is a by youth for youth mental health advocacy group. We cover a lot of things within that scope, whether that just be talking about kind of the everyday things that young people experience that are quite unique to our day and age, and then diving really deep into policies that will affect young people, and bringing that into a really accessible language. I think when it comes to co-design, what works really well is it's something that is going to differ between community to community, and group to group, but I think you have to meet young people where they are. I think what works really well in these spaces is when you bring young people to the table and they are able to speak really honestly, really candidly about their experiences. And that is something that is really powerful, right? And I think when you kind of conceptualize young people, it's also really important to consider kind of a very wide range of what that looks like. I'm 21. My experiences as a young person kind of navigating the mental health system now is going to look very different to how old I was when I first started that journey, right? Which was when I was about 7. So within youth, there is a very large kind of window that we need to be tapping into. So what I think works really well is being able to meet those individual experiences where they are, recognize those differences, and work among that. And what's so beautiful about co-design is that it's really encouraging for young people. When young people are invited into these spaces, lots of young people feel the weight that brings, recognizing that the one experience is not necessarily going to cover all of it, but it is really encouraging and a powerful experience for young people. But what works really well is really just tapping into that at the level in which they are, knowing that that's not necessarily going to look like a whole policy brief or free and frank advice, but there's something so powerful with that and bringing them along the journey, because I can promise you that young people probably have some insights that you wouldn't necessarily expect them to have, or knowledge on an issue that just they have by nature of their experience.
Thanks, Amy. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Ariel Waldron tōku ingoa, ko Ngāti Pākehā o. My name is Ariel. I'm here with iLead today. iLead is a youth-led disability advocacy organisation. We're led by youth for youth. And I guess this is a good example of the kind of opportunities they can offer. So I would say orgs like iLead bridge a really important gap. They help get youth to the organizations so we can collaborate and co-design. I'll touch more on the barriers later, but getting here in the room is often one of the big issues. But once we're here, I've found government organizations and agencies and NGOs very open, very willing to listen, really good at reflecting back what I have to say and what we have to say as youth. But often the issue is actually getting in the room. But that is why it's great to have these facilitation networks. As Amy said, it's often about finding youth where we are. So you might be looking at youth who are still in education, whether that's intermediate, primary, even high school, university. A lot of youth are working, whether they've left school or they're disabled and are volunteering or doing other things in their own time. I think it's important to remember what a diverse community the youth community is, and that it's really important to try and, I guess, reach out or give all of us a voice, and that's going to look different in different spaces. But my experience so far has been really positive. I've found most agencies, whether it's Ministry of Health, Te Whatu Ora, the Hiringa Mahara, NZTA, Waikaha, whichever agency, they're really good at maintaining kind of a small group situation or experience, which is really good for getting everyone's voice heard, especially because a lot of youth haven't had much experience participating in this kind of space. And so it can be quite hard for them to jump in if you have a lot of other outspoken youth who are more experienced with advocacy. And what else? Yeah, I think this webinar today is a pretty good example of what good co-design can look like, aside from maybe the 200 of you out here watching us. On our side, we've got quite a small group we have access to. We've kind of been introduced to each other before we have to share anything really personal. And there's been a lot of communication before the event. And I think these are all really good foundations for allowing confident and open youth co-design. And then as Alex touched on, from here, you just need to keep the process going. So it's truly co-design and not just a one-off consultation. Yeah. I'll hand over to you, Maggie.
Kia ora koutou. My name's Maggie. I am no longer a young person. I'm more youth adjacent now, but I started off as a youth worker when I was 17, and I did that for about 9 years, and then shifted to doing a PhD, which focuses on the health and well-being of young adults with ADHD, which was a result of being diagnosed as a young adult, and also seeing that research on young adults with ADHD wasn't actually reflecting the reality of our experiences. And I had engaged in several different, I guess, advisory roles and co-design projects during my time as a young person. And I'd say that the best one that I engaged with, which was an offshoot of the Picky project, which was or is a sort of mental health program in the Greater Wellington region targeted towards moderate to mild mental health distress. The offshoot of that group was probably, the best co-design that I've engaged in. From the very beginning, it was a blank slate, and it was clear that we as young people had the control over where we were heading. So it was very much like an iterative thing. We could see immediately how our perspectives and decisions were taken on, and it wasn't a hassle for the academics to take on what we had to offer. It was very much that we were driving every step of the way. I've seen quite a few bad co-design projects, but I'll talk about that later. But I think involving young people at the very beginning, having a blank slate, feeding back how their, I guess, advice or perspectives have been taken on are probably the biggest things that make a co-design project work effectively. So those are the main things.
Kia ora, my name's Abdulla. Similar to Ariel, I'm part of the iLead team at Yes Disability. And similar to Maggie as well, I'm youth adjacent. But a lot of what we do at iLead is co-design. What we've seen from implementing co-design with young people is that like similar to some of the points that have been touched on, it needs to start from the beginning. Right, the young people need to feel that you do value their input. It's not a one-off shoot type of thing or a consultation. And what that helps is when the young person is feels that they have invested in a project or are invested in a project, there comes that emotional investment. And with that emotional investment, the young people are more dedicated to the project. They're more willing to put in the time, the effort towards that project. And as well, it shows them that it helps them feel more of they're actually supporting their peers, right? And the cause that they are striving for. And I think that's the best, that's the way that I think a lot of young people want to help or support their peers as well. similar to some of the points, again, is co-design is pretty much just understanding and providing that platform for young people to really speak their mind and feel that they are actually being valued and are and have the input actually being implemented rather than having it ticked off and saying, we'll talk to young people. When they see the results actually being implemented, then they feel that it is a worthy cause and they'll continue with their efforts as well.
Kia ora koutou. Awesome insights. I think I will pick up the barriers question because some of you tried to get into that naturally and said you'd come back to it. So I think we could have that question now, just in terms of in terms of your experience with co-design, if you have come across any barriers, and when in thinking about those barriers, and some of you have already spoken to this, what would make it easier for young people to be involved in co-design? Just really keen to hear from you. I know there's a couple of questions in the chat, and I have got those, and we'll come to those after this question, if that's okay. So I'll just open up the floor with the barriers question to the panel.
If I could, this is, I think, is where a lot of the kind of brunt of the conversation is going to go. And I think if I were to identify kind of two barriers, they're kind of twofold and they could probably be looked at quite like a linear pattern. I think is kind of has been mentioned, it's about kind of getting young people at the table and then having a further conversation about kind of what this looks like in co-design, how that looks like a follow-through process. I think what's really interesting about this dilemma, though, is that there are so many young people who really, really want to engage in these co-design processes. They have gone through potentially traumatic or very difficult pathways throughout the mental health system, and they want to be able to kind of help support that for preventing that from happening from their peers, which is, I know, how I entered the advocacy space. But the thing is that when young people are struggling with their mental health, I think probably one of the last things that they're going to do is be scourging on places on how they can sign up to be a part of like co-design, right? So that means that there is kind of like a level of duty for people in this call to actively search out those groups. And I think you'll find that there's quite a few there, and especially based in local communities that are willing to contribute. So that's the first problem, right? Is that we need to be actively searching out these young people. I think that kind of what I touched on earlier is then the young people that you then get around the table are all of those who are willing to speak up and talk about their experiences, which is really important and is really, really crucial. Reflection is a huge part of how we build better. But I think we also need to be considering those who are struggling in the here and now. Again, looking back into high school when the last thing I wanted to do was really talk about that, or even when I was younger, and kind of going through therapy when I was 7 years old, right? I wasn't therefore thinking, how am I going to kind of, help contribute to this? I was just thinking about the here and now. So if I could get a little bit kind of meta here, I think an interesting question to pose is we need to co-design the co-design process, right? We need to have young people at the forefront of those design processes, because young people who are at that table and who are willing to kind of actively search out those opportunities, or that you reach out to and are saying, yes, I am here to contribute, they're the ones with the wider connection, right? With the wider network into those communities who are actively struggling and who maybe don't want to necessarily kind of sit at those tables and therefore have like a more policy focused conversation, right? So I think co-design works at a lot of different levels. I think it's important and it needs to be a part of every single step of that process. But what it also needs to look like is that young people are dictating how that process looks, right? Because I'm sure everyone in the call who has ever raised a young person or a teenager, young people are very easy to lose in terms of conversations and engagement. It's as soon as young people feel condescended to, patronized to, especially when they're struggling, you lose us, right? Because it's so in every aspect of our life, it feels like we're being told what to do. And so when we're struggling with these very personal kind of crises, the last thing we want to do is, kind of add to that. So I would say in order to overcome these barriers of finding opportunity, that's a call to action for you to actively search out these groups of people who are kind of presenting the by youth for youth and are wanting to kind of serve in those processes. And then second is letting those groups also therefore say how we're going to reach those wider networks. So that's kind of the two barriers and the kind of follow through that I would see and I would recommend and I would kind of, encourage everyone here to really think about is that the co-design needs to go just beyond, we're going to have this group of people on that conversation, but young people also need to be kind of influencing that co-design process.
Thanks, Amy. I've just been scanning the chat and hoping to touch on a couple of these maybe points in my answer, because I don't know how much time we're going to have for additional Q&A afterwards. I agree with everything Amy said. Like, it's important to get youth in the room. Seeking out groups who aren't as engaged is really important. Having the whole process be youth-led would be the ideal. But I think we all know that there's some, I won't say glaring issues, but some gaps in that approach. But this webinar is very characteristic of a co-design or consultation session. It's on Zoom, like I said before, smallish group on Zoom through a ministry org. And it's being run well, but I think this really misses a gap for youth who don't have the time, need, ability, want, whatever, to be in this kind of space, to commit this kind of time, to find these opportunities. And in my experience, these opportunities, you can't really find them. Like iLead has offered me a lot of awesome co-design and consultation opportunities, but I wouldn't have been able to find those on my own. And not everyone wants to be part of an org like this. Like I think iLead is a great tool for agencies and orgs to use. I see someone's asked, what are our thoughts on using an org like iLead as opposed to developing a youth lived experience network or group from the ground up for every project? And I personally think iLead is a really good resource for that. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Us as members are probably more familiar with the process. And there are other groups for kind of other spaces, like we're disability focused, obviously, but some of you may have heard of the Revision project, which is like a youth auditing service for physical spaces and physical accessibility. So there are other services out there that can kind of help provide youth to projects as they're in development, and provide consultation on the projects as they continue or when they're finished, I know the Youth Hub here in Christchurch had, I think, Revision come through and kind of assess the space and give final feedback, and they were involved throughout the project. So I think those groups can be quite good for the continuity of interaction or involvement. A big gap that I do see, though, is with our rangatahi and even tangata whaikaha, like Māori youth, are not very well represented in these spaces. Like I don't know if any of us for panellists whakapapa Māori. I don't. And I was in a consultation last week with Whatuora on the draft mental health and wellbeing strategy, and there was a huge number of rangatahi in that consultation, many of whom are employed as lived experience experts at different orgs, which is great to have them in the room, but I've never been in a co-design group with that many rangatahi. Like it's quite rare. And they brought that up a lot, saying like we're missing, we're dropping the ball with Māori and Pacifica youth. I think the way we deliver our services comes across very inaccessible in Pakeha. Like this very formal webinar space isn't necessarily culturally safe or friendly for any youth, to be honest. This is very like business, business coded. I don't have the answer for what we do there, but Yeah, I think we need to think about a different mode of service delivery, maybe. Like if we're thinking about vulnerable youth or disengaged youth or rangatahi, going to maraes or youth centres like the youth hub or youth groups or talking to youth workers who know where youth hang out. Like I think, as Amy said, actually going and finding those groups and engaging on their terms is going to be the only way to start reaching these underrepresented voices. Because if we just keep doing this, we can get representative voices like the lived experience experts I worked with last week, but that's still only getting like a distilled version of what is needed, you know. And then some other smaller barriers are like money, time, you know, we all have jobs or volunteer kaupapa or what have you. And often these experiences are unpaid and take up multiple hours, you know. So I think even if you find youth who want to engage, if they're in high school and they can't make a daytime time slot, because these are always in the daytime in my experience, that's not accessible in and of itself. And I know not every org can afford koha, but you're really going to miss out on the more vulnerable youth are more likely to be losing out on time and money if they can participate in something like this. So I think those are two other kind of resourcing things to consider. Yeah. And aside from that, kind of trying to simplify the language and processes that we use to engage on these is really important, because we can't be assuming everyone is like research level qualified on mental health services, you know, especially if you're really unwell, as Amy said, you're not going to have as much capability and capacity to engage in something really complex and formal. Yeah, I think that's me for now. My interface has disappeared, so if the next person wants to jump in, I can't actually like take myself off the screen right now.
I'll jump in. So I guess the way that I would respond to this question as an academic versus when I was a young person is slightly different, but the overarching theme is the same. So the biggest barriers that I saw when I was engaging in co-design as a young person was, I guess, trust that you know, my perspectives would be taken on, trust that my perspectives were valued through, you know, financial means. If they wanted us to do like additional homework or additional work, that it wasn't on the side and not being remunerated, but it was actually, yeah, being valued through financial means. Also, I guess the trust that this project wasn't like a tokenistic thing, because that would pop up quite a bit, where they'd bring in a whole bunch of young people and essentially it would just be a tick box exercise. And the way that I guess my answer differs as a, you know, youth adjacent person versus an academic now is that kind of what I saw as a young person with, you know, what I was saying not being taken on board is like, how can I prevent that as an academic? How can I ensure that what I'm doing is ethical, that I am, you know, hearing what the young people are saying to me in my research and at every step of the way feeding back to them how their perspectives have been taken on, and if it hasn't been taken on, then justifying or explaining why it hasn't been taken on, because yeah, that trust is so important. And we as academics or youth workers or anyone that's kind of engaging with young people in co-design, word spreads, And if you do things poorly, then, you know, some young people may be less trusting to engage in this kind of work. And then when other young people will ask their friends about what it was like for them to engage in co-design, you know, they'll tell them. And so we have a responsibility to do it well, and to really value, what young people have to say, rather than it being a tokenistic thing. There's plenty more that I'd say, but those are the main ones.
Yeah, that's touching on a couple of points that have already been mentioned. I think one of the main barriers that I've experienced when going through code design is actually the resources and the time that it takes to build that trust. We understand that obviously for certain organizations or for certain agencies, the types of projects that they do need to be quite fast-paced, and therefore you don't have the time to actually build that relationship of doing 4 or 5 meetings with the young people to build that trust. So therefore, I think that's one of the key barriers that I've experienced, is that actually having that time to build it, which I understand, not every organization is, or, that's out of their control based off the project that they're doing, based off possibly deadlines, funding, all of that type of stuff. So therefore, I think it's more of communicating that to the young people and being transparent with the young people that you are working alongside with, and telling them, as much as we want to implement all your ideas, there are some time constraints, and there are some limitations on how much we can do as an organization for the project. What would, and I think to counter that is just more of communication. I feel at least young people are quite understanding when you communicate to them and you're upfront with them, and not have that feeling of not trying to sugarcoat things, right? Obviously, there are things that are beyond our control, and if you communicate that, then I'm sure the young people will be understanding, and accepting of that.
Kia ora koutou. That was an awesome discussion from the panel on that question. Really appreciated that. It's just okay. Cool. All good. There's a number of questions in the Q&A, and I think the panel have touched on a lot of it, on some of those questions in there already. But I guess just kind of have another question for the panel. We've got 5 more minutes, don't we? I guess just to leave, just to ask the question in terms of a final one, what would you say for our audience is the most important thing to consider when starting a co-design journey? So you'll have a lot of people online look at potentially service designers. I've seen some academics answer questions. So there's maybe think about even some of the pros and cons of using existing youth advisory groups or other processes that exist. But yeah, what would you say to the audience today? And then you've touched on this already, to be honest, but what would be that most kind of important consideration before people on the call begin their co-design journey? So I'll just go around and ask you that question. So yeah, it's about we've got about 5 or 6 minutes for that. Thanks, panelists.
Amazing. What a big question to end it off, right? I think in terms of the easiest way to kind of get that process going is it's not going to be an easy one, right? It does take a lot of resources to co-design, but what you get in the end of it is a much better service and kind of final product at the end of it, whether that be a piece of research in kind of in evidence base or kind of service providing, you're going to get a lot better service at the end of it, right? It's really easy to tell as a young person because you're able to just kind of enter those spaces and it's designed kind of with those specific interests in mind. So I think at the offstart, it's about it's about taking initiative, right? Is about kind of finding those groups. There is a benefit of kind of using those already there youth advisory groups, but I also think it's equally important to think about the voices that aren't represented within those groups and having a broader reach. So potentially rather than relying on kind of one group youth advisory board, let's bring in 3 different young people from 3 different organizations and that brings in 3 different networks, right? I think it starts with initial conversation with those young people, talking about how they can bring those networks and their communities in with them and then what that's going to look like from point A right through to how that's going to look like when it comes to assessing the success of that co-design process. So I think that's what's really important. Young people aren't going to reach out to you guys being like, hey, well, I'll at least talk from my experience. I don't like sending emails. I like replying to them though. So kind of taking the initiative to reach out because it can be a very daunting experience, but the desire and the want to contribute is there. So making sure that you're reaching out to new groups of young people who can bring in their own communities and then really stepping through that process with them. There is no shortage of young people who want to help with this and who will bring those own communities there. So again, kind of as I said in my last answer, it's a bit of a call to action for everyone on the call to reach out to those groups and think about how they can bring those young people in. And in terms of if there are barriers in terms of what that's going to look like or how to make that easy as possible, the young people will have an idea of how to bring young people into that conversation safely.
How to sum it all up? I think there's a really good momentum at the moment in the industry, especially in the mental health space. Like I'm seeing increasing co-design and consultation opportunities, and government orgs are getting a bit better at identifying different groups within the lived experience community of kind of vulnerable groups, like consulting with we're not just consulting with youth, we're consulting with disabled youth, we're consulting with rainbow youth, we're consulting with young parents maybe. Like I think there's growing maybe literacy in the space around who we need to engage, but I think the momentum needs to continue. And as we've identified here today, there's a lot of unengaged communities who are probably honestly the most vulnerable and being dropped or kind of missed out by a lot of these systems. So I think finding new ways to engage with those groups, whether it's working with existing community providers, like often Mahara will have a stronger rangatahi engagement program. So why do we reinvent the wheel? Why not go into those spaces in contact with the professionals in the space, whether it's the events organizer or some of the kaumātua on the marae or something, and asking them, what do you think the youth want? How would they like to be involved in this? Like, I think we kind of need to start trying some new approaches while keeping up the momentum that we do currently have. And also, as touched on a little bit earlier, I think showing that youth ideas have been brought on board is really important, because so often I'll come to a co-design session and it is more like a consultation, as Alex touched on earlier. Like the session goes great, the speaker or the researcher reflects back what we're saying to them, and then you hear nothing. And maybe a report comes out later, but never sent like this is what we included from the group, or this is how it's going to change the process. And often the reports are not even put into easy read format or anything. Like there's not a lot of accessible kind of follow through So I think that's somewhere else we could improve. But the fact you're all here to listen to us and try to learn is a good step. I think we just need to keep this going.
There's so many different points which I think are important, but I guess the main one would be like being honest with yourself and also the young people that you're engaging with about like, and I'm saying this as like an academic, being honest with how much power you're going to give away. Because I find that as someone that engaged in co-design projects and also as a budding academic, there's, I guess, the surface level kind of initial stage of saying like we're engaging in a co-design project, but then realizing that you actually have to give away a lot of your power and trust in the young people, and I think not being honest about what that looks like with yourself, and not being transparent about how much the young people can actually shape the project is what affects or is kind of the core of what breeds that distrust, because there's such an unequal power dynamic between young people and academics. And if you really want to engage in co-design, just recognizing and challenging how much power you hold and how much you're going to take, I guess, the young people's voices on board. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I want to co-sign everything that Maggie just said, pretty much. The first step is that willingness to want to, implement co-design. You have, I've experienced some organizations that aren't wanting to or aren't willing to, but it's part of the tick box or tick box, I guess. So I guess the first step is that willingness, and similar to what Maggie said, is having that willingness to relinquish some of those decision making and some of those power, I guess, in those conversations, in those meetings. But again, obviously, young people can't decide everything, right? So therefore, there'll be funding already, contributed or decisions already being made. But like Maggie said, it's talking to those young people and actually highlight and notify, okay, these are the changes or these are the areas that we want your voice on and that we can actually implement, rather than providing that false narrative or that false hope that, yeah, we can make something that's not realistic come into play. And yeah, I mean, that's just my personal experiences. But yeah, just similar, just co-sign everything that Maggie just said.
Well, ngā mihi koutou. What an awesome wrap up. And I just wanted to just thank you again, all the panelists, Alex, Walker, Laura, everybody here today, Kelly and Angela for your amazing interpretation. Thanks for sharing the screen with us. It's been lovely. And just really, really quick summary. So much expertise and knowledge has been shared with us today. So I just really want to acknowledge that with the panelists and the young people sharing their views and their expertise. I've got so many things from the panel, but there was a big kōrero there about the power dynamic and being able to enable a process through co-design that that enables participation, diversity, meeting people where they're at, and in the spaces that they're already in, enabling young people's voices to get in the room. But throughout the whole process of a project, from inception to dissemination, Alex, you've got so many sound bites. I love it, so I'm just going to use them. So it's not just the upfront stuff, it's all the way through to the end, making that input visible and really recognizing the expertise right through the process. Amazing points. Finding kind of that balance between involving young people at the right time in the right way, so and making sure we're hearing from a very diverse group of people. And trust came up time and time again, in terms of resources, emotional investment. There's just so much to this process for young people. So for the adults and the decision makers in the room, for the people in the meetings that can support young people to participate and have their voices heard, the outcome will be a better designed service. It'll be something that's will engage young people and ultimately be effective and achieving the outcomes that we're all looking for. So just a little bit of a wrap up there, and just a massive thank you to you all. Really quick, the webinar recording will be available on our website and via YouTube. We'll send out a link to everyone that registered, and we're going to send out a little feedback form. Please just send us your feedback about that. Only takes a couple of minutes. Really value your feedback on that. Got 2 more minutes, so I think I might just close off with our karakia. Thanks to everybody for joining us today on the webinar. I hope you all got something out of that. I'm sure you would have. So just really love to hear from you all about that awesome kōrero that was shared today. I'm going to close off with our karakia whakamutunga, which has actually been gifted to us from our lived experience whānau. Pauhihiri paurarama, te aho I roto, marama I roto, tēnā te pau o te pau ka eke. Nā te pau o ēnei kōrero, ka mā a te ariki, ka mā a tauira. Kia puta ki te whaiau, ki te ao marama. Hui e te ora, hui te marama, paumi e, hui e, tā iki e. And in English, this work has been successful. My day is ended. It is very clear and understood. I am free to go, to the point that it glows within me. I'm happy with my day, my achievement. It illuminates me. Things feel good. It is work that is gradually succeeding. Things are heading in the right direction. The meaning behind this work. For now, we set the work aside, liberate both teacher and student alike, and lighten up, allowing us to understand wisdom so we can rest. For well-being and freedom, we are joined, gathered, united. And that is all from us today. Koutou, thank you very much again. Ka kite.